Okay, I need you to just sit with this number for a second. $580 billion every single year.
That's not a typo.
That is not a typo. $580 billion gone from the African continent every single year to corruption, profit shifting by multinational corporations, and illicit financial flows, according to the African Development Bank's own president, Akinwumi Adesina. And he didn't mince words about it. He said, and I'm going to paraphrase here, it's like pouring water into a leaking bucket. Africa cannot build the future it needs if money keeps draining out of it like this. So today, we're not going to just sit here and shake our heads. We're going to do something different. We're going to ask the most obvious question that nobody seems to be asking loudly enough. What could Africa actually build with that money? What could Africa actually build with that money? Because this isn't abstract. These are real projects, real roads, real power, real cities that are sitting stalled, underfunded, or completely abandoned, while $580 billion evaporates every year. Let's get into it. Where is the money going? Before we get to what the money could fund, let's establish where exactly it's going. Because when people hear corruption, they picture some guy stuffing cash into a briefcase. Which, to be fair, does happen. It happens, but that's actually the smallest slice in this problem. The African Development Bank breaks it down like this. Of that $580 billion a year, roughly $148 billion is lost to what we traditionally call corruption. Bribes, theft of public funds, embezzlement. That number alone, just corruption, is already staggering. But then you dig deeper. Another $90 billion leaves to illicit financial flows, which is money that's illegally earned, illegally moved, or used through shadow systems. Think illegal mining revenue, smuggling, trade fraud. And then the biggest chunk, and this is the one that doesn't get enough attention, $275 billion lost to profit shifting by multinational corporations, meaning companies operating in Africa, pulling resources, doing business on the continent, and then using accounting tricks to move their profits to low-tax jurisdictions overseas, Luxembourg, Cayman Islands, Ireland, so they pay almost nothing as tax in Africa, which means African governments collect almost nothing, and then they have to go borrow money from the IMF and the World Bank to fund the same infrastructure that should have been financed by their own tax base. It's a cycle that's almost designed to keep the continent dependent. UNCTAD, that's the UN Conference on Trade and Development, has noted that in countries with high illicit financial flows, governments spend 25% less on healthcare and 58% less on education than countries with low outflows. Let that sink in. 58% less on education. 58%. That's not a policy failure. That's money being physically taken out of classrooms. And it's $1.6 billion every single day. That's the daily rate. Africa wakes up and $1.6 billion is already gone before midnight.
What $580 billion can build? All right, here's where we get into the real math. Because we want to be specific. We're not going to say this could fund schools and hospitals. We're going to name the actual projects. Stalled projects. Projects that are sitting right now, waiting for money that is somehow not there. Starting with one of the most symbolic pieces of infrastructure on the continent. Project number 1, the Abidjan-Lagos Corridor Highway, $15.6 billion. This is a proposed 1,028-kilometer coastal route that would connect 5 West African countries, Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria. 5 countries, 1 road, 4 to 6 lanes wide, expanding to 8 lanes as it enters Lagos. And the cost? $15.6 billion. So here's the math. Africa loses $580 billion a year. The Abidjan-Lagos corridor costs $15.6 billion. That means Africa could fund this highway, this single transformational piece of infrastructure connecting 5 national economies, over 37 times with just 1 year's worth of what it loses to financial leakages. 37 times. You could build this road 37 times over, or if you want to be practical about it, you could build this road once, then have $564 billion left over. And think about what this road would actually do. West Africa has some of the fastest growing economies on the continent. Nigeria alone is the largest economy in Africa. Connecting Lagos to Abidjan with a modern highway doesn't just mean faster travel. It means supply chains. It means regional trade. It means goods that used to sit at border checkpoints for days flowing freely. And right now, it's a dream. A very expensive, very stalled dream. Project number 2, the Grand Inga Dam, Democratic Republic of Congo, $100 billion. Let's talk about power. Because if there's one thing holding back development in Africa across the board is electricity. Africa has 600 million people with no access to reliable power. 600 million. And the solution to that, or at least a massive part of it, has been sitting on the Congo River for decades. The Grand Inga Dam.
Located at Inga Falls in the Democratic Republic of Congo, this is not just the largest proposed construction project in Africa, it would be the largest hydroelectric project in the world. Full stop. Designed to generate an average of 39,000 megawatts annually. To put that in perspective, China's Three Gorges Dam, which is currently the most powerful dam in the world, the Grand Inga would generate almost twice as much. Twice as much as the world's most powerful dam, sitting in the DRC, untouched.
The total estimated cost, including transmission lines to carry the power across the continent, $100 billion. So here's the math. Africa loses $580 billion a year. Grand Inga costs $100 billion. Africa could fund this dam, this project that would bring electricity to potentially hundreds of millions of people 5 times over in a single year. 5 times. You could build 5 Grand Inga dams with 1 year's losses. And instead, the World Bank pulled its support in 2016. Disagreements over implementation, funding challenges. The project is effectively stalled. 600 million people without reliable electricity, and the money to fix it is literally leaving the continent every single day. $1.6 billion a day. Grand Inga costs $100 billion. If Africa stopped the bleeding, it could fund the Grand Inga Dam in 62 days. 2 months. Yes, 2 months to potentially solve the energy crisis for an entire continent. Project number 3, the Lagos-Calabar Railway, Nigeria, $10 billion. Let's talk Nigeria, because Nigeria is a perfect case study in what this problem looks like at a country level. Nigeria is Africa's largest economy, something like 220 million people, and it has one of the most underdeveloped railway systems relative to its size and economic output of any country on Earth. The Lagos-Calabar Railway was supposed to change that. 1,400 kilometers of rail connecting Lagos to Calabar, passing through major cities like Port Harcourt, Uyo, and Aba. Estimated cost $10 billion. For context, Nigeria loses an estimated $18 billion of corruption alone at the country level, according to various governance reports. That's just Nigeria. That's just corruption, not all illicit flows. So Nigeria loses $18 billion a year to corruption. The Lagos-Calabar Railway costs $10 billion. Nigeria is essentially losing enough to build this railway every 8 months to financial leakages. Every 8 months. And the railway is not built. What happened with the funding? Initially contracted to a Chinese company, which then couldn't raise the necessary capital. Now an American company's in talks. It's been back and forth for years. Meanwhile, goods that should be moving on train tracks are sitting in traffic on roads that are also falling apart, which is costing the economy more money, which is worsening the poverty that makes corruption more attractive in the first place. It is a doom loop, and the exit from the loop is right there if the money stayed in the country. Project number 4, Konza Technology City, Kenya, $14.5 billion. Now, let's talk about what Africa's future could look like. Not just roads and power, but the knowledge economy, the tech economy. Kenya's Konza Technology City, dubbed the African Silicon Savanna, located 64 kilometers south of Nairobi, planned as a full smart city. Business process outsourcing, software development, data centers, research institutions, light manufacturing, the whole ecosystem. Cost $14.5 billion. And here's the painful irony. Microsoft recently announced it wanted to invest $1 billion in a data center in Kenya. That project stalled amid a row over payment and power supply. A $1 billion investment from one of the world's largest companies stalled over power. Which brings us back to Grand Inga. Everything is connected. No power means no data centers. No data centers means the tech economy you're trying to build doesn't materialize. No tech economy means brain drain continues as Kenya's best engineers leave for Silicon Valley. And Konza, still moving slowly. The project has been raising concerns among stakeholders for years. $14.5 billion to build it. Africa loses $580 billion a year. That's Konza funded 40 times over in a single year. 40 Konza technology cities could have been built. Or one Konza, properly funded, fully powered, and actually operational. One Silicon Savanna that could retain Africa's talent and start competing with Asia and Europe in the digital economy. Project 5, Bagamoyo Port, Tanzania. $11 billion. Let's go to the East Coast, Tanzania, the Bagamoyo Port. Tanzania wants to be a regional economic powerhouse in East Africa, and they've got one of the best geographic positions to do it, sitting right on the Indian Ocean, with access to landlocked countries like Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, DRC.
The Bagamoyo Port Project is an $11 billion megaport in the historical coastal town of Bagamoyo. When complete, it's designed to handle 20 million containers annually by 2045, which would make it the largest port facility in East Africa. Primarily funded by China, it's a tri-state venture between Tanzania, China, and Oman, with China Merchants Port building the port and an Omani wealth fund developing a 1,700-hectare special economic zone right next to it. And yet, it's stalled. Negotiations broke down. Tanzania pushed back on some of the terms. It's been in limbo. $11 billion against $580 billion lost per year. Africa could fund Bagamoyo Port over 52 times in a single year. 52 times.
52 times. One port that could transform East African trade could be funded in about a week's worth of what the continent loses annually. 7 days of not hemorrhaging money builds the largest port in East Africa. That's what we're talking about here. Project number 6, Egypt's new administrative capital, $45 billion. Now let's talk about something truly audacious. Egypt is building an entirely new capital city, from scratch, in the desert, 45 kilometers east of Cairo. This place doesn't even have a name yet. It's just called the new administrative capital. And it is enormous. 21 residential districts, 25 commercial districts, a park double the size of New York City Central Park, 90 square kilometers of solar farms, 40,000 hotel rooms, a theme park 4 times the size of Disneyland, 2,000 educational institutions, 663 hospitals and clinics, and a brand new international airport. It is essentially an entire country being built inside a country. The transfer of government ministries, embassies, parliament, that part alone is estimated at $45 billion. The full build-out will cost significantly more. Egypt, to its credit, is actually making progress on this, but it's doing so with a debt burden that's crushing its economy. Egypt's external debt has been one of the most discussed crises in recent African economic history. And yet, Africa loses $580 billion a year. The $45 billion phase of Egypt's new capital could be funded over 12 times in a single year of recovered financial flows. 12 new administrative capitals. Or one properly financed with breathing room for a country that right now is borrowing at painful interest rates just to move its own government offices. Project number 7, the Kenya Standard Gauge Railway. $9.9 billion. You can't do an African infrastructure conversation without talking about the SGR, the Kenya Standard Gauge Railway. This is close to home for a lot of our viewers. 969 kilometers of railway from Mombasa on the coast all the way to Malaba on the border with Uganda. Total cost, $9.9 billion. And it's partially built. Phase 1, Mombasa to Nairobi, 472 kilometers, is done at a cost of $3.27 billion. Phase 2A, Nairobi to Naivasha, done at $1.5 billion. But Phase 2B, from Naivasha to Kisumu, needs $3.8 billion. Phase 3, Kisumu to Malaba, $1.31 billion. Those sections are incomplete. The railway stops, literally stops, in the middle of the country. So you've built the expensive part, you're running trains, but you can't connect to Uganda. You can't be the regional trade corridor you were designed to be because the last few $1 billion aren't there.
And Kenya is sitting on a massive debt from the first phases, largely borrowed from China at commercial rates, while the remaining phases sit unfunded.
$9.9 billion for the whole thing. Africa loses $580 billion a year. The entire SGR could be funded in 6 days of the continent's daily financial losses. 6 days to complete a railway that's been in progress for years and is stuck because of a few $1 billion? 6 days.
What Africa could actually become? Let's zoom out for a second, because we've been going project by project, and every single one of those numbers is staggering. But let's look at the macro picture. The African Union, through something called PIDA, the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, has a list of 69 priority projects covering transport, energy, water, and digital connectivity. Total cost, $160.8 billion. $160.8 billion to potentially transform the entire continent's infrastructure, connect markets, enable trade, power cities, connect students to educational opportunities. Africa loses $580 billion a year. The entire PIDA project list, all 69 projects, could be funded 3.5 times over in a single year. Every road, every power project, every digital connectivity initiative that the African Union has identified as a continental priority, funded 3.5 times over in 1 year.
And here's what research says would happen if that infrastructure actually existed. The UN Economic Commission for Africa estimates that Africa's infrastructure deficit currently reduces economic growth by 2% annually and cuts productivity by up to 40%. African workers are producing 40% less than they could be, not because they're working less hard, but because the roads aren't there, the power isn't reliable, the ports can't handle the volume. And the flip side? If Africa were to invest $155 billion annually in infrastructure, which remember is less than a third of what it's losing, studies projected it could add $2.83 trillion to Africa's GDP by 2040, more than doubling the continent's current GDP. More than doubling the economy of an entire continent by stopping the bleeding and investing what should already be there. And for comparison, China, during its infrastructure boom, was investing 6.7% of GDP in infrastructure annually. Vietnam was at 5.1%. Africa right now is at 1.3% of GDP. Africa's government spent an average of $34 billion a year on infrastructure over the last measured period. The continent needs $155 billion. It's currently losing $580 billion. The math doesn't lie. This is not a resource problem. Africa is not poor. Africa is being drained.
Beyond the numbers, we've been very numbers heavy, and that's intentional, but let's be honest about what these numbers mean in human terms. In 2021, 490 million people in Africa lived in extreme poverty. That's 36% of the continent's population, more than a third of everyone on the continent living on less than $2.15 a day. And more than half of African governments are now spending more on debt interest payments than on public health care, more on interest than on keeping people alive. Because the money that should be generating tax revenue, that should be funding hospitals and schools, has been shifted offshore by corporations, has been siphoned by corrupt officials, has been misinvoiced out through fake trade documents. The UN's former special advisor on Africa put it perfectly. She said the $88 billion Africa was losing annually, and remember, that older figure is now nearly $580 billion, should be seen through the lens of millions of people who could have been lifted out of poverty, thousands of hospitals and schools that could have been built, and job opportunities that could have been created for Africa's young population. Africa has the youngest population of any continent on Earth, median age under 20. The future demographic dividend is enormous if those young people have electricity, education, infrastructure, and opportunity. But if the money keeps draining out, that demographic dividend becomes a demographic crisis. Young people without jobs, without power, without roads, without hope. And we've already seen what that leads to: protests, instability, migration. And then Western headlines wonder why Africans are crossing the Mediterranean. The answer is $580 billion a year.
What needs to happen? Okay, we don't want to just be doom and gloom. What actually gets fixed here? What needs to happen? A few things, and they involve everyone, not just African governments. First, transparency in corporate taxation. The $275 billion lost to profit shifting by multinationals is a global governance failure. Countries in Europe and North America are hosting these tax structures. They are the destination for profits that should be taxed in Africa. The South Africa G20 presidency in 2025 was actually a significant moment for this. The African Union pushed for a UN framework convention on international tax cooperation, essentially an agreement that would close the loopholes multinationals exploit. Second, stronger anti-corruption institutions domestically. The issue is often not that laws don't exist, it's that anti-corruption agencies lack independence, lack prosecutorial power, and lack resources. Third, and this is interesting, technology. AI-driven financial monitoring, blockchain-based procurement systems, better trade data systems. Tools that make it harder to misinvoice exports or hide bribes in procurement contracts. Because right now, a lot of this illicit activity is only possible because of opacity. The same data tools that allow companies to optimize ad spending could flag suspicious trade transactions in real time. And fourth, international cooperation. African countries cannot do this alone. Tax havens in small jurisdictions often work because larger economies protect them or refuse to implement information sharing agreements. The money that's stolen from Africa is sitting in bank accounts in Switzerland, in shell companies in the Cayman Islands, in London property. You cannot retrieve it without the cooperation of those jurisdictions. UNCTAD found that curbing illicit financial flows could almost halve Africa's $200 billion annual financing gap for the Sustainable Development Goals. Almost halve it, without a single dollar of foreign aid. And that's the real point. Africa is not a continent begging for charity, it's a continent being robbed and asking the world to help stop the robbery.
Let's bring it home. $580 billion a year, $1.6 billion a day. The Abidjan-Lagos Highway, connecting 5 West African economies, funded 37 times over.
The Grand Inga Dam, enough power for an entire continent, funded 5 times over. Every single AU priority infrastructure project, all 69 of them, funded 3.5 times over. The Kenya SGR, completed in 6 days of losses. Nigeria's Lagos-Calabar Railway, in 6 days of what Africa loses, or every 8 months of corruption in Nigeria. And the Kenyan tech city, the African Silicon Savanna, 40 times over. Every year. This is not a vision of what Africa could be in some distant utopian future. This is what Africa is actively losing right now. Adesina said it best, pouring water into a leaking bucket. You can keep pouring, keep borrowing, keep appealing for aid, keep sending delegations to international conferences, but until you fix the bucket, nothing changes. Fix the bucket. That's the whole conversation. Fix the bucket, and Africa doesn't need anyone's charity. It builds its own Grand Inga. It connects its own coasts. It powers its own Silicon Savannas. And 1 billion people, 1 billion young, talented, resourceful people get the future they were always supposed to have. If you found this video informative, like it, share, and subscribe, because the first step to fixing a problem this big is enough people understanding it clearly enough to be angry about it. And you should be angry. Until next time, see you around.